Tiz, a vulnerable young Brazilian girl, finds herself speeding through the night towards the lights of a big city. Her companion is a man who has promised her parents that he will find their daughter work as a maid. What awaits her there is something different, however, and her life becomes increasingly fraught with danger, both mental and physical.
Interwoven into this tragic and violent storyline is the account of a young doctor whose life and love affair in the south of England are in stark contrast to the dangerous, sexually abusive situation in which Tiz finds herself. Yet their stories and that of their families become closely linked. You are listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight by Deborah Vaughan.
Part 16. Rescuer's Delight. Chinn, a friend of Tiz, who he visits as a customer, realises she is desperately ill. He executes a daring raid to release Tiz from her captivity with the help of 2 fellow workers and takes her to a local hospital. Meanwhile, the girls in the Sparkling Delight brothel are being closely supervised at mealtimes by the Turtle to ensure their bodies look attractive for the punters.
The workers in the Sparkling Delight brothel were having their midday food. The Turtle, who presided over the meal in person, always insisted that everyone sit round the table to eat, so that she could supervise exactly what they were consuming. This was not because she cared about the prostitutes, but because she wanted to make sure they looked attractive, with none of them becoming either too fat or too thin. Each day she cast an expert eye over them, in much the same way that a farmer constantly monitors his herd of pigs to make sure they will fetch a good price at market. Tiz, who hated the communal trough, was sitting very still in between Yaritza and Magdalena, trying to make herself as small as possible. The Turtle, who was still trying to fatten her up, dumped a large bowl of beans and rice in front of her. Tiz looked at it with dismay. She'd never had a huge appetite, but over the last few weeks it had been getting smaller and smaller, so that now she felt she couldn't manage anything at all, not even one mouthful. Looking at the mountain of food on her plate, she despaired, like a weak old man who has just been told he must climb Everest or die. To add to her misery, every time she breathed, she felt a sharp pain in her chest and back. This had begun on the previous day and was getting worse as each hour passed. Desperately, she shrank even further down in her chair, frantically hugging herself because she knew what was going to happen next.
"Eat, little flower," rasped the Turtle, glaring at the girl, her voice rising in a frustrated crescendo. "Eat! Eat! Eat!" Reluctantly, Tiz picked up a spoon and poked it in the gooey mass on her plate. She pushed it this way and that, hoping that the Turtle would find someone else to torment, but she knew, without looking up, that the cruel, implacable eyes were staring straight at her. All chatter stopped and the room fell completely silent. The old woman got up from her place and walked around the table. Tiz's heart contracted with fear as she heard the menacing footsteps approaching. Then the wizened old face thrust itself into hers. She shrank back in her seat, gazing in terror at the circle of glowing red lips so close to her nose. "If you don't eat now, this minute," snarled the harsh voice, "I'll give you to Alexio." Whimpering with terror, Tiz lifted the spoon and, with the Turtle's sour breath wafting round her face, put the food into her mouth and swallowed. Somehow she managed to force down several mouthfuls under the old woman's watchful gaze. Satisfied, the Turtle went into the kitchen to fetch a clean plate. "Quick!" hissed Yaritza. "Give some to me and Magdalena." Tiz rapidly transferred as much food as she dared, so that when the old woman returned, she gave a triumphant smile when she looked at Tiz's now almost empty plate.
At the end of the meal, Tiz walked slowly upstairs to the bedroom and climbed painfully onto the top bunk, which had once been Yara's, but now was hers. She sat there for a long time, very still, clutching her chest and willing the pain to go away. To console herself, she pulled out from under the mattress her shell and the 2 handkerchiefs. Wrapping the shell up in the hankies so that it looked a little like a doll, she cradled it in her arms and peered drearily out of the tiny barred window next to the bunk. This gave a view down the steep hillside, and miraculously she could glimpse, in between the jumble of the nearer roofs, the estuary and the distant docks. There were the trading vessels unloading their cargoes, looking small and far away, and out on the waters of the bay yet more ships were coming and going. There were pleasure craft too. A yacht, white sails set, was tacking out towards the sea, and several speedboats wrote their messages of freedom across the water in winding, frothy white wakes. It was a beautiful sight.
After a few moments, Tiz turned away from the window and looked down at the shell, wrapped in its covering of hankies, that lay cradled in the crook of her arm. She hugged it to her. "Oh, shell, shell, please help me," she murmured. "I'm so tired." Slowly she slumped down on her dirty mattress and put her head onto the pillow. With one hand she held the shell to her ear and listened again to the faraway sound of the sea, reliving the feel of the warm waves on her body as they gently rocked her back and forth. Presently she fell into an exhausted sleep. Somehow, when work began, she managed to climb down off her bunk, put on her gaudy wrap, and slowly creep down the stairs, clinging on to the banister for support. Her head swam and the pain in her chest was like a constricting red-hot band, so that she felt she could hardly breathe. Once downstairs in the waiting hall, she slumped down on the velvet couch, hunched over with pain, and waited with the other girls to be looked over by the punters. Somehow, nothing seemed to matter any more. Customers came and went, but she was hardly aware of them or of the fetid atmosphere of stale smoke and unwashed bodies. At last she heard the dreaded rasping voice. "Little Flower, go to room 1 at once!" Making a superhuman effort, Tiz struggled up from the couch and walked very slowly into the bedroom.
Chinn was sitting in bedroom 1 of the Sparkling Delight waiting for Tiz. He hadn't been to the brothel for a few weeks because in the immediate aftermath of Yara's escape, he'd been given the task of setting up a new bicycle repair shop in another suburb of the city. He'd taken Louise and Bruno with him, and together they'd worked hard developing the business so that the shop was now thriving. He was aware that he'd promised Yara that he would make sure Tiz was all right, so as soon as it was humanly possible, he'd made the journey back to see how she was. He'd missed her more than he could explain, and during the hectic weeks of the shop's opening, she'd been continually at the back of his mind like a nagging toothache. As he'd wrestled with tricky repairs, talked to new customers and chivied Bruno and Louise, he'd worried about her constantly. "I hope she's all right," he said to himself for the umpteenth time as he turned into the entrance to the brothel. Then, when he'd scanned the girls on the couch and had spotted Tiz, he hadn't known whether to be happy or sad. He'd hoped that by now her father would have taken her away, but there she sat, looking somehow smaller than he remembered, and here he was, sitting on the bed, waiting for her.
The door was slightly ajar, and he was suddenly aware of the sound of hesitant footsteps approaching across the waiting area outside. He was immediately transported back to his childhood, remembering a time when he'd sat in the living room at home, listening to an identical sound. In his mind's eye, he saw the living room door slowly open to reveal his old grandmother leaning on 2 sticks, her grey hair straggling round her vacant face, her back bent and her chin moist with spittle. His eyes widened in alarm. Who was coming? The footsteps came closer, the door was pushed slowly open, and there was Tiz framed in the entrance. For an awful moment, Chinn thought that he was looking at his grandmother once again. The bent posture was the same, and also the vacant expression. But no, it was Tiz. Whatever had happened to her since his last visit? This girl was thin beyond belief. Her form, from being elfin, was now gaunt and skeletal. Her skin was a strange grey colour, and her hair dull and lifeless. But it was her face that appalled him the most. All her interior energy seemed to have died. There was only the smallest glow of life still to be seen in her eyes, and this appeared to be fading while he watched. She stood there, breathing in an odd, laboured fashion, one hand holding onto the doorframe for support, and the other clutching her chest.
Chinn leapt to his feet and hurried over to the door. Gently, he took her by the hand and sat her down on the bed. "Tiz, oh Tiz, what have they done to you?" he cried, sitting down beside her. In a tiny, croaking voice, she replied,
"It's my chest, Chinn. It hurts. I can't breathe."
"Lie down," he commanded, and gently arranged the soiled pillow under her head, pulled up the room's only chair, and sat down beside her. Tiz seemed unable to say anything else, and lay like a corpse on the bed. Chinn sat frozen with alarm as he listened to her erratic, rasping breathing. "She's dying," said a voice in his head. "Do something." But what could he do? Suddenly, like an epiphany from on high, the answer came to him. He had to get her away from here and take her to hospital. He sat very still, running his hand agitatedly through his hair, trying to think. Gradually, as his hairstyle became more and more dishevelled, a plan formed in his mind. He would come next morning with Louise and Bruno, and together they would snatch Tiz away from the brothel and take her to hospital. Gently he bent over the recumbent form on the bed and spoke urgently into Tiz's ear. "Tiz, where's your room? I'm coming to get you tomorrow to take you to hospital."
"Up the stairs. First room. On the right," came the gasping reply. "Top bunk. Under the window."
"Be waiting for me," commanded Chinn, and then sat down again, trying to plan exactly what he would do. He thought dismally of the immense Alexio and the indomitable turtle. What would happen if they tried to stop him? But try as he might, he couldn't work out an easy way to get the terrible duo out of the way. So giving his hair one last absent-minded ruffle, he stood up and walked swiftly towards the door, knowing that whatever happened, he was going to rescue Tiz before she died. On his way out, he drifted across the hall, looking for the staircase Tiz had told him about, trying hard to look unobtrusive. As he reached the far side of the waiting area, the turtle spotted him and assumed he wanted another girl.
"Which one do you want now?" she called in a hard, cracked voice. Pretending to inspect the prostitutes, Chinn suddenly spotted Magdalena sitting at the end of the couch. Bending over her, he whispered hurriedly in her ear,
"Where's the door to the staircase? I'm coming to rescue Tiz early tomorrow to take her to hospital. Make sure she's ready for me." Magdalena looked up startled, but quickly understood what he was asking.
"The door's there," she whispered, pointing. "I'll get her ready. She's really ill." "Make up your mind. Who do you want?" The turtle's voice crackled across the hall. Chinn straightened up, looked round, mumbling something about not being sure, and ambled out of the brothel as casually as he could.
The next morning, when his 2 assistants came to work, Chinn called them into the little room that served as his office. Thinking they had done something wrong, they stood in the doorway, gazing at him apprehensively. Chinn wasn't sure whether he ought to ask for their help, but at last he looked up from his desk and said quietly, "Amigos, I have a favour to ask you. I want to rescue my favourite prostitute from the Sparkling Delight. She's very ill, and if she stays there, she'll die. I'm going to get her this morning and take her to hospital. Will you help me? There might be a fight. I don't know, and I need a bit of support. We can shut the shop for a couple of hours and just hope the owner doesn't come along to check on us." "You can count on me, boss," replied Bruno, his eyes dancing. "It'll be like the cinema." And crouching down, he whipped 2 imaginary guns from their holsters and fired a quick round out of the office door. Tucking the guns back into place, he looked at Chinn, eyes wide with excitement, and a big grin on his large, amiable face. "Me too," said Lewis. "I owe you one for bringing me here. When do we go?" "We'll go now," replied Chinn, looking at his watch. "We'll stay in our overalls, and we can each carry a large spanner. Then no one will think there's anything strange going on." So, armed with a spanner apiece, they set out across the city like a small, determined industrial posse.
The first thing Chinn did when they arrived at the Sparkling Delight was to get a taxi and instruct the driver to park outside the brothel with his engine running.
"We'll look after that creep, Alexio," Lewis volunteered gleefully as they stood opposite the brothel. "You go and find Tiz." "Don't touch him unless you have to," ordered Chinn. "We don't want to go to prison." "OK, boss," responded Bruno cheerfully. "Just leave him to us. We'll do fine, we promise." The 3 walked across the road and pushed open the street door leading into the passage, where Alexio usually sat on guard. To their satisfaction, they found him lounging on his chair, fast asleep and snoring loudly. "Keep guard over him," ordered Chinn quietly, and swiftly made his way past the turtle's blessedly empty desk and into the hallway where the prostitutes usually sat. This too was empty. A shaft of light from the open street door illuminated the tawdry scene, the faded glamour of the couches, the dirty floor, and the pervasive stench of sour cigarette smoke and unwashed bodies.
Quickly he scurried across to the staircase and up to the first floor. He hesitatingly opened the door Tiz had told him about and was confronted by the small dormitory where the prostitutes slept. Since this was early in the morning, all of them were still in bed asleep after their night's work. Going to the bunk by the window, he found that Tiz too was asleep. She was lying facing him, clutching something wrapped in dirty bits of rag. Her face was pale, and her breath whistled through her teeth in shallow gasps.
"Tiz! Tiz! Wake up!" he whispered urgently, but she seemed not to hear him. Desperately he gazed at her, wondering how he was going to get her down from the top bunk. His voice, however, had woken Magdalena, asleep on the bunk below.
"What are you doing here?" she questioned sleepily. "Oh, it's you, Chinn. Wait a moment, and I'll help you.
You'll have to, replied Chinn urgently. She can't hear me.
Right, said Magdalena, scrambling out of bed. Between the two of them they managed to lift Tiz off the bunk and onto the floor. She stood swaying unsteadily, still clutching the small bundle tightly in her hand. But even though she was so desperately ill, she refused to let go of it. At last, after a few frantic attempts, the two gave up.
We'll just have to take it with us, whatever it is, said Chinn in desperation. It was clear, however, that Tiz was incapable of walking, so Chinn took her in his arms. Magdalena opened the door for him, and he managed to struggle down the stairs and across the hall. Just as they got level with Alexio, the snoring stopped, and the fat man opened his eyes. "Hey, what's happening? Where are you taking her? You can't do that!" he grunted, and tried to get to his feet. It was then he became aware that his shoulders were being firmly held down by two strong men who seemed to be brandishing large spanners. "Sit still, old fool," commanded Lewis in his best film-star voice. "If you don't, it will be the worse for you." And he waved his spanner menacingly in front of Alexio's face. Quickly, Chinn hurried down the passage and out to the waiting taxi. He laid Tiz on the back seat and ran back inside. "Get going!" he shouted. Bruno gave Alexio a quick shove, which half toppled him off his chair, and the two of them ran swiftly out of the door, round the corner, and into the maze of alleys that surrounded the brothel. Chinn hopped into the taxi beside the driver, saying, "Quick! To the nearest hospital!" By the time the doorman had regained his balance, lifted his vast bulk off the chair, and lumbered down the passage, the taxi was well out of sight. He gazed up and down the road, rubbing his eyes. But there was nothing to be seen but the everlasting traffic and the bustling crowds. "I must have had a nightmare," he said to himself. "I could have sworn I saw a young man in an overall carrying a little flower out of the door. How odd. There's nothing there, though." And he sat back down in his chair and lit a cigarette.
So it was that until the midday meal, when Tiz's absence was discovered, nobody except Magdalena knew that she'd escaped, by which time she'd completely disappeared.
As the taxi made its slow way along the roads near the brothel, Chinn leant his head back on the headrest and let out a sigh. "Phew, that was a near thing," he said to the taxi driver. "What are you up to, amigo?" the man queried. "She your girlfriend or what?" Chinn laughed wryly. "No, she's not my girlfriend. She's a prostitute I know, and she's very ill. What hospital do you think I should take her to? I don't think she's any money. In fact, I'm sure she hasn't." The taxi driver thought for a few seconds. "I think the Sacred Heart would be your best bet, amigo. It used to be run by the convent, but it's a government hospital now, although the nuns still do a lot. It's a kinder place than most. My wife went there last year, and they treated her really well." "Take us there, then," ordered Chinn.
The taxi threaded its way slowly through the city traffic and eventually drove through an imposing gateway and up a tree-lined drive. Hospital buildings could be seen in among the trees, and eventually the car came to rest outside the outpatients department. Chinn paid the driver and thanked him for his kindness. Together they lifted Tiz out and set her down on a nearby bench. Many people were sitting on seats under the trees or on the grass, while members of their family queued at the outpatient's door. The taxi driver looked at them shrewdly, and then turned to Chinn, who was standing irresolutely behind the seat supporting Tiz, and not knowing what to do next.
"Looks to be a fair-sized queue, amigo," he said, "but I've seen worse. I come here quite often, and I've known days when people were nearly dead by the time they were seen. You go through that door and get a ticket from the desk, he added, pointing to the entrance to the department. I'll stay with your friend until you get back. The sooner you book your place in the queue, the better. When your turn comes, your number will come up in that window over there. Chinn looked at the window and saw a large number 40. As he watched, it changed to 41. A woman near the head of the queue then waved, and a man got up from his seat under a nearby tree and made slowly for the doorway. Chinn followed him into a noisy, crowded waiting area and was given a ticket number 101 by a disinterested clerk behind the desk.
Returning, he sat down beside Tiz, who was slumped on the seat, barely breathing, and put his arm around her, holding her up.
We must sit in the shade, he thought desperately, as the sweat began to trickle down his back. So lifting her in his arms, he stumbled over to the space on the bench under a nearby tree that number 40 had just vacated. There were already 2 people sitting on it, a mother and her young daughter, who had her arm in plaster. But when they saw how ill Tiz was, they moved closer together, and Chinn was able to put Tiz onto the bench and sit beside her with his arm around her for support. She sat with her head on his shoulder, breathing with great difficulty through clenched teeth and parted lips.
"What's the matter with your friend?" questioned the mother. "She looks very ill."
I don't know, replied Chinn. I wish I did. Tell me, he added, do I have to go and queue as well as look in the window for my number?
No, replied the woman, but sometimes if you don't, the people in the line won't let you through when your turn comes.
Oh no, said Chinn anxiously. What am I going to do? I can't leave her, she'll fall off the seat.
Look, replied the mother kindly. What number are you?
101, replied Chinn.
We're 103, said the woman. My husband's in the queue. I'll go and tell him to keep your place too. He's a big man. Nobody messes with him.
Thank you, he replied gratefully. Thank you very much.
Chinn became very anxious as the minutes ticked by and the numbers slowly crawled up and up. He sat willing them to go faster, but it made no difference. 2 hours passed before 101 at last appeared in the window. He got stiffly to his feet, lifted Tiz off the bench and hurried as fast as he could through the queue, past the burly husband and into the waiting room.
You have been listening to Tiz from the novel The Garden of Sparkling Delight. You may find more information by searching the web for The Garden of Sparkling Delight.
Soaring to the skies with the wind in your hair, safe place only can hide, trusting in those to keep you safe from harm. No hope tomorrow, nowhere to run, wondering how your life could be so cruel, just like the others, so vulnerable. Surely in your dreams you would fly with an eagle, sheltered in his wings, soaring to the skies with the